Gone global. Leading Britain's conversation. The Nigel Farage Show.
Mr. Nigel Farage.
Thank you, Donald. Good evening, everybody. A very unusual press conference took place today outside the Houses of Parliament. Tory MP Sarah Wollaston and Labour backbenchers Chuka Umunna and Luciana Berger came out to tell the press that they are withdrawing the amendment they wanted voted on next Tuesday, and this was the amendment to go for a second referendum. Here was Luciana Berger.
Because the Labour leadership and front bench won't back a people's vote, there will not be a vote on a cross-party people's vote amendment next week. This is not good enough. Labour should be clearly setting out a different course, not facilitating a job-destroying Brexit.
This is not good enough, says Luciana Berger. The Labour leader needs to break the promise he made to the British people in the referendum. Well, that's effectively what she's saying, isn't she? So basically, they're blaming Corbyn. They're saying because Corbyn won't go for a second referendum, they're not going to put it before the House of Commons. But it's not just on their side of the debate. It's not just Corbyn who won't back their so-called people's vote. Because interestingly today, we saw the General Secretary of Unite, Len McCluskey, very smartly dressed, walking up Downing Street, extraordinary, isn't it, to meet the Prime Minister. And here's what Len McCluskey had to say.
Well, I think you've seen that the Labour Party have laid down an amendment which clearly gives us a way out of the current impasse. Whether that will be accepted or not, we'll have to wait and see, because the truth is, over the next 8 weeks, anything could happen. We could have a general election. That's the people's vote that I want.
So there we go. Len McCluskey wants a general election. He's not backing a second referendum, but he is, you heard, they're backing the other amendment, which they will all now get behind, certainly on the Labour side, it seems to me, and that is the one put down primarily by Yvette Cooper, that basically says if the government can't get its deal through by the end of February, there should be an extension to Article 50. And it does, I have to say, look to me like that will now probably get through. But hey, it's a fast-moving game. But why did the second referendums, why did the People's Vote campaign decide not to put this amendment forward? Is it because they thought they'd lose next week in the House of Commons? Is it because actually they fear they might lose in the country? Is it because they're actually playing a tactical game and they realise they've only got one shot at this and they've got to get it right? So they'll back the Cooper Amendment and they will bide their time. And that's really what I want to ask you tonight. You know, have they dropped it because they think they'd lose the vote? And if you think, yep, they definitely wouldn't have got it through the Commons next week, which I agree with, call 0345 6060 973. Maybe you think they're playing a clever, longer game, in which case text to 84850. And are they beginning to think that if they did put this to the people again, that actually resistance to this is growing to the extent they might be in trouble? Please tweet your thoughts using the hashtag Farage and LBC at LBC, and of course Facebookers who watch us live can comment there too. No appetite I get on Twitter because I think they are afraid of the result of another referendum. It would expose them. Well, I was with Lord Adonis earlier on today and I said, well, what if you got your way and there was a second referendum, and even by an even bigger margin we said we wanted to leave? Would you just go on ignoring it? And we're told, oh, no, the next referendum is the one that really counts. But hey, folks, we were told that with the last one. I'm going to Liverpool to speak to John, a first-time caller. Good evening, John, and welcome to LBC.
Good evening, Nigel. I'd just like to say about what you're talking about, the withdrawing the amendment today. They're just playing a long game. They've learned the lesson of the Corbyn vote of no confidence in the Prime Minister. He never had the numbers, and they're just waiting. But the Cooper and Dominic Grieve amendment next week, the precedent that it'll set, if there ever is such a thing as a second referendum, is absolutely horrendous for this country. Because the working man in the street, the man and woman in the street, wherever they are, they only have one voice in this country, and that is the little cross on a piece of paper that took hundreds of years and many, many stepping stones to get to. The moment that is destroyed, the referendum result itself becomes secondary to the vote, the sacrosanct vote. The moment that's destroyed, we're only left with the old-fashioned way of solving our disputes, and that is blood and slaughter, because there's no other way if you haven't got the vote.
So you, John, you really genuinely fear that what Parliament are doing is breaking down trust in the entire democratic process?
They're destroying democracy, and the oldest democracy, and this democracy in this country is looked at all over the world.
Yep.
If they destroy this vote and make this vote counterfeit, because that's what it'll become, the democracy is finished. You're wasting your time.
But John, they think that you didn't really understand what you were voting for, and they think they're cleverer than you, and they think they're better than you, and they think they're doing this in your interests, John.
Well, they would do, wouldn't they?
Yeah, of course they would.
It's not that they're cleverer than any of us, Nigel, but they are more powerful. That's what they are. They have the hidden hands behind the steering wheel.
Yeah, they're more arrogant, John, too. They're a lot more arrogant too. They really are. John, yeah. I share your concerns, and it's one of the reasons why, if Brexit is completely foiled by these people, we have to make sure that there are democratic organisations and parties that people can go and support, because if they don't, then you're right. If you take away from people that freedom, they will be tempted down a different and dangerous path. John, thank you for picking up the call, and wow, that was a very, very passionate thought there, wasn't it, for John? Vicky is a first-time caller from Leeds. Good evening, Vicky.
Good evening, Nigel.
Hello there. Now, are you a supporter of a second referendum, Vicky?
Absolutely not.
Right. So, are you pleased in a way that they didn't put this amendment forward to be voted on next week? Or would it have been better to get it voted down in the House of Commons?
I think it's better to vote it down, because all they're doing at the moment, it's just party politics. It's nothing to do with Brexit.
Yes, there's a lot of that.
Politics amongst themselves, which is why they don't want to put the amendment through with fear of Corbyn. They want to be party-related rather than Brexit-related.
Yes, they want the Labour Party's endorsement for it, don't they? And Corbyn
absolutely.
And Corbyn refuses to give it. And you heard Len McCluskey earlier, the biggest trade union leader in the country, and he refuses to endorse it. But Vicky, they might come back with this at some other point in the future, mightn't they?
They might, but what would the question be? What question would they ask?
Yeah, of course.
At the moment, it's no deal or deal.
Mm-hmm.
That's the specific. It's about trade, where people voted for various reasons.
Mm-hmm.
And deal would mean saying Theresa May's backstop, which means remain, and no deal would say you don't want a deal, we stay as we are.
Well, Vicky, I tell you what,
is remain.
I tell you what, Vicky, I think there is some movement on the backstop, and just after the 6:30 news, we'll go through some exchanges in Brussels today. There could be some change coming. On a scale of 1 to 10, Vicky, how angry are you?
Extremely.
I get that.
Number 10.
Number 10, right. Thank you for calling us. And it's interesting, isn't it? A lot of what we're seeing is, and a lot of it seems that people in the north of England are the ones more than anybody who are saying they're done with this. They can't stand the politicians. They're not scared of a no-deal Brexit. And lots of evidence for this. Question time last week, response to Isabel Oakeshott saying we should leave with no deal. Sky News, stunned by the debate they had in Leeds last Sunday evening, where a majority backed a no-deal Brexit. It looks like the North is really pretty firm on this. That's not fully scientific, but it's certainly what I'm seeing. Nigel, the Remainers are getting cold feet about a people's vote. They know we don't want another referendum. Tony, they try to play games with figures. They try to play games with polling. You know, you ask somebody, do you think the people should have a say? They say, yeah. You ask the same person, do you want a second referendum? They say no. And they use spurious figures to try and make out there's this huge appetite out in the country for a second referendum, and there isn't. The best figures I saw on this were a series of options being given to people, you know, remain, second referendum, leave on May's deal, leave with no deal, and second referendum was the first choice preference of just 8% of people in that YouGov poll. Darren is another first-time caller from Chelmsford in Essex. Darren, good evening.
Good evening, Nigel.
So why did they decide to give that very strange press conference and not push ahead?
because they know that if there was a second referendum, they're not going to get it through.
Mm-hmm.
And they know that they're on the sticky wicket with everything. And my suggestion is, let's take the backstop off the table and replace it with no deal.
Well, here's the difficulty, Darren. Here's the difficulty. Effectively, these amendments in the House of Commons next week is going to be a chance for Parliament to say that they simply won't accept a WTO no deal.
Okay.
And that gives, and that does give the Prime Minister a problem. However, and by the way, aside from the backstop, I think the rest of the deal's rubbish. 39 billion stuck inside customs union rules for quite some considerable period of time. I mean, lots of reasons why.
It's absolutely ridiculous.
It is ridiculous.
They'll just keep us in, and they'll keep playing on the deal until they get things like Gibraltar on the table and
fisheries,
fishing rights, and other things like that.
Yeah.
Why can't we make it legally binding for a vote by a politician that's made on something like this when the 498
I know.
voted for Article 50? That should be legally binding.
Well,
they should be held accountable.
I think what should be legally binding is the referendum result, because whatever our Constitution says, it was made explicitly clear, Darren, we will abide by your result. Darren, I'm sorry to disappoint you, but I think next week a no-deal Brexit will be taken off the table. Personally, like you, I'd be very happy with it, and I see it, folks, right now as the only way of actually delivering the referendum result. Anton from Devon says it's just a temporary delay. They will wait for the deadline to come closer and then throw it in at the last minute. Anton, I don't think that the so-called People's Vote campaign have given up because they've withdrawn this amendment next week. They're biding their time, but I do think they're beginning to understand there is not much demand for this out in the country, and they also privately are beginning to think, if we did have a second referendum, we'd probably lose. You're listening to the Nigel Farage Show here on LBC. It's now 6:15 and time for the news headlines with Lisa Aziz. The second referendum MPs, the people's voters as they call themselves, have dropped their amendment, due to be placed before Parliament next week because I think they knew they were going to lose it. Doesn't mean they've gone away, folks. They may be playing a tactical game, and they might for now be happy that the Yvette Cooper-Dominic Grieve amendments go through and we finish up with a gun effectively to the government's head, get your deal through, or we will extend Article 50. They will also next week, I think, take the prospect of a clean break WTO Brexit off the table, which will make a lot of people pretty angry. A lot of you very focused on this second referendum as to what the question would be, and that's something the People's Vote campaign have never really been able, to put forward anything where they've got any sense of unity. I mean, Jim from Merseyside says if we have a second vote, it's got to be the deal or a WTO clean break. We can't have Remain. We've already voted on that one. A lot of you do come through and say this. In my view, Labour will destroy their own party and lose their core support if they back a second referendum. Absolutely, Andrew in Bristol. And that, I think, is what Corbyn is aware of. It isn't just that Corbyn has been a Eurosceptic all of his life. He realises the massive damage this would do the Labour Party in South Wales, the Midlands and the north of England. If there ever is another referendum, there should not be an option to Remain. We've already voted on that. Yeah, there are lots of you saying the same thing. Roger is a first-time caller from Croydon. Welcome, Roger.
Good evening.
So do you think that this People's Vote campaign, this Blairite People's Vote campaign, are on the back foot a little bit?
I think so. I think they've got frightened now, and I think if they went for it and there was a general election later, they'd take a hammering for it.
Yes, and that's why Corbyn won't support it. Yeah.
Yes, I believe so. He just wants to be Prime Minister.
Yeah, well, there are a few people out there that want to be that, I think, Roger, but and that seems to matter to them more than getting Brexit done properly. No, I think Corbyn electorally probably has been quite wise in resisting this.
Yeah. If there was another election, I'd vote to leave, and I voted to Remain the first one.
Did you? And why have you changed your mind, Roger?
Just the way we've been blackmailed or treated and threatened, and this is England, mate. It's Britain. Stand up for ourselves.
So, Mr. Barnier...
Tell them where to stick it if they might. And some of the people, like companies today, Airbus, threatening us.
Yeah.
Who support Europe so much, I go to China quite a lot, and I'm staying in Tianjin for the Chinese New Year. Go there quite often.
Yeah.
And if you saw the Airbus factory there, it's huge. That's how much they support the EU.
Well, yeah, and this same argument.
Cheap labour.
Yeah, well, and also it's a global economy, Roger. I mean, I know that James Dyson, and I spoke about him a couple of nights ago, James Dyson, is concentrating more of his business in Singapore. But then I read today only 4% of Dyson's global sales are in the UK. And that's the other point, Roger, but I would make to you about Brexit, is that there's a massive transfer in the world of power and money from west to east going on, and being stuck inside the European Union does not make us flexible enough to deal with it. Roger, thank you. And Roger thinks they're losing their bottle. What does Steve, a first-time caller from Southport, think? Good evening, Steve.
Hi, Rog. Well, they're all playing party politics, aren't they? All pulling Brexit in a different direction. But here's the thing. If we have to have another referendum, that means 17.4 million of us are political prisoners in our own country. If we don't leave on the 29th of March, 17.4 million people automatically become political prisoners of the Remain establishment. And that can't be right. We shouldn't have to beg for Brexit. We won it fair and square. Now, it should just be happening.
Well,
you know what
Steve,
I mean? We should not have to beg for it.
Steve, I agree with you. But it isn't just the fault of the Remain establishment. It's also the fault of this government, isn't it? Who told us they deliver on this, so they haven't got very far, have they?
Well, because Theresa May is an establishment patsy, a willing patsy, put there to take the hit of not delivering Brexit. Her whole prime ministerial career is to be sacrificed on the altar of not delivering Brexit. But you know what the big problem is now? She hasn't thought what's going to happen next. What happens if what you politely call civil unrest? What happens if the Brexit riots break out? As the first chap from Liverpool touched on.
And do you believe... Steve, let me ask you, do you genuinely think that will happen? I mean, it has happened before in British history, but not that often.
Well, I don't want it to happen, but I'm concerned it could happen. If we don't leave, 17.4 million people, some of them will consider themselves freedom fighters, because we'll all be political prisoners. The most amount of people that have ever voted on anything ever will become political prisoners, and some of them will turn freedom fighters.
Well, Steve, all I can say is if we do come to that, if that betrayal becomes complete, I'm going to do my best to make sure they have democratic ways of expressing that outrage and getting their own back. Steve, thank you. Lots and lots of passion here. And I'm being told off here. Nigel, stop calling it the people's vote. It's the second referendum. I do always say the so-called people's vote. I do my best, but hey, there we are. Nigel, if the Labour leadership had any sense, they would offer to support the deal in return for a subsequent general election. Well, it's interesting, isn't it? This whole business of the deal, crushed by 230 votes, buried, you'd have thought, forever. And yet, there's just something in me says there may be a change in the weather coming on this. Rishi is a new caller from Southampton. Good evening and welcome.
Hi, Nigel. How are you today?
I'm all right, watching this with great fascination. I certainly think that the second referendums are on a little bit of a back foot, but I'm worried that what we are going to finish up with next week is a situation where we either get a very bad deal or Article 50 gets extended.
In my opinion, we have to push for a no deal. The MPs voted on it last year that once we pass Article 50 and we can't find a deal with the EU, we have to leave with a no deal. And my parents voted back in 2016. I was too young to vote. I'm 18 now.
Yep.
My parents voted for Brexit because they wanted to get independence for this entire country.
Absolutely.
And so that we can have our country in our control. And the thing is, we could have voted for Remain because my dad works in Europe. He works in Austria as an electronics engineer. But he thought the best for this country is to leave the European Union. And for MPs who are backing this loser's vote, that's a betrayal to our democracy and betrayal to our constitution. So when Mr. Rees-Mogg supported for prorogation of the Parliament, I would have fully supported him because we've got Labour traitors and even some Conservative traitors who are going against our democracy, our vote. And my dad also had to come back from work just to vote in this referendum. And that was the first time he voted as well.
It's very, very strong language, Rishi. You know, an 18-year-old saying that people are traitors in the Labour and Conservative Party. You feel that strongly, yeah?
Yeah, I really do feel that strongly because I've seen EU bureaucracy and how it has forced down wages in my country, and also how damaged and how corrupt EU politicians are. We all got to the vote. It was a fair vote as well. Both sides had their say into it.
Yeah, they certainly did.
And the Brexit side won by a majority. And there are a few Remainers who say, we have a democratic vote, let's get on with it. But there are a few who have been so keen on trying to overturn the result of this referendum from the very beginning.
They never accepted it. They have colluded with Mr Barnier against our national interest ever since that day. And I think the whole thing is disgraceful. Rishi, look, I'm with you. Article 50 was clear. 500 voted for it. We should now be leaving. You know, if she can cobble together something and get a deal through, fine. If not, we just leave. And yet, I have a feeling that by this time next week, I'll be talking to you and we will have seen effectively Parliament put a WTO Brexit off the table. I hope to goodness that I am wrong, but I think that's where we're going. Rishi, thank you very much indeed. Boy, we are getting some very passionate callers here today. Every single one of them has never called LBC before. That includes James, who's a first-time caller from Doveridge in Derbyshire. Good evening, James.
Good evening, Nigel. Former Conservative voter.
Right, OK. Well, there might be a few more of those if we go on like this.
I think there'll be many more of us, chap.
Yeah.
Basically, I think Jeremy Corbyn's playing a very dangerous game because I think he's been so wishy-washy over everything. Whichever way it goes, they just won't be held accountable to anything.
Do you not think, in a way, James, that maybe Corbyn is one of Brexit's biggest friends? I mean, he's got a parliamentary party and now a membership who are pretty fanatical about the EU for reasons that are completely beyond me, but hey. And
he's holding the Blairites back.
But he's been resisting them, hasn't he?
Yeah, he's holding the Blairites back. Actually, the biggest threat to Brexit is probably not the Labour Party. I think it's more the Conservative Party.
Well,
there's too many backstabbers within that party.
Well, the trouble with the Conservative Party, James, on Europe is that you just can't trust the Tories because they say one thing at elections and then do another. And Mrs May, I think, has been more guilty of that than any Conservative leader I can remember in my lifetime.
She's not had the leadership. Unfortunately, Jacob Rees-Mogg isn't in charge. Boris swings, but Boris goes whichever way the wind blows. She's just a weak leader.
Well, I don't know. Boris has committed to Brexit and he is backing it pretty hard. James, just tell me, where do you think this all ends?
Where do I think it ends? I do think they'll extend Article 50.
Mm-hmm.
I think they'll try and push us into remaining. I don't think there will be a second referendum because there'll be hell up.
Mm-hmm.
And whether we'll get a no-deal Brexit or a good deal at the 11th hour, I don't think we will get a bad deal, actually. I think it will just be voted against. And next time general election comes, and I'll be voting for you.
All right, thank you, James, if I'm there. And by the way, Jacob Rees-Mogg, of course, will be broadcasting on LBC tomorrow night between 6 and 7 p.m. You're listening to the Nigel Farage Show here on LBC at 6:30 in time for the news with Lisa Aziz. And for sports fans, it is Calypso Clapso for the England cricket team in the first Test match in Barbados. We've just been bowled out for 77. I was supposed to be there this week, but I cancelled it because of Brexit. Perhaps every cloud has a silver lining. I'd like to be there in one way, but hey, not good for England. Now, here's something really, really interesting. Ever since the backstop first hove into view, we have been completely dominated in these negotiations by Monsieur Barnier and everybody else. And indeed, the main reason that deal got voted down as comprehensively as it was is the backstop effectively is a trap that gives us an option in the future, if we can't reach the right trade deal, of either taking part of our country and almost annexing it to another, or staying forever tied inside the European Union's customs union. But yesterday, Michel Barnier, and this is through an interpreter, but Michel Barnier said something that could prove to be very significant.
If we're facing a no deal, we will, together with Ireland, who is directly concerned territorially speaking, and with the UK, we'll have to find a way to carry out checks. If there's no hard border, we will still have to do checks and controls somewhere. It's something that we owe to consumers, to protect consumers and to protect companies within the single market. So we'll have to find an operational way of carrying out checks and controls without putting back in place a border.
So we can do it. And this backs up a report from the European Parliament issued back in 2017, where they looked at how would this be dealt with if there wasn't a genuine free trade deal, if there were tariff differences and longer term, perhaps regulatory differences. And the European Parliament came up with a plan that said, hey, this is no problem. You do checks away from borders. You won't do many checks anyway. And when it comes to goods going back and forth, they can be logged online. You know, it's kind of easy peasy. So there was Michel Barnier effectively saying that we'll find a way through this, whatever happens in the next few weeks, without any sense of a hard border. And I thought this morning, the Brussels correspondent for the Daily Telegraph, James Crisp, and he was questioning the European Commission spokesman, Margarita Schinas. I thought Crisp put it brilliantly this morning.
During Mr. Barnier's speech, he was asked about what would happen in a no-deal situation. And I know you did the clarification yesterday, but he said we'll have to find an operational way of carrying out checks and controls without putting in place a border. He also said in his newspaper interviews, we'd be obliged to carry out controls, but my team have worked hard to study how controls can be made paperless or decentralized. So, can we call this maximum facilitation? And if all of this is possible, why do we need the backstop?
Absolutely.
Why don't we just do this? Or is Mr. Barnier guilty of magical thinking? Thank you.
I am a bit lost in this question that brings
he is, isn't he?
Various question marks with some value judgments. What I can suggest is that you concentrate indeed on the reply on the speech to Michel Barnier, which you quoted correctly, and to my clarifications to Paddy yesterday, which provide the full picture. I don't have anything else to add on this.
I suppose if I'm going to boil it right down, if there are ways to avoid a hard border in a no-deal scenario, which Mr. Barnier suggested, why do we need the backstop?
Well,
you can write whatever you like. I'm here to express the position of the Commission. I will read you with interest.
Why do we need the backstop? I mean, he put it beautifully, didn't he? Why do we need the backstop if even Mr. Barnier is saying there's a different way of doing this? Now, why is this so significant? Well, for those that were tuned in yesterday, you'll know there are quite a lot now of conservative Eurosceptics, even ERG group members, who are saying if you get rid of this backstop, if you time limit this backstop, even though, Mrs. May, we think the rest of your deal is total and utter rubbish, we might just support it, because if we don't support it, the Remainiacs are going to extend Article 50, perhaps one day force a second referendum upon us, and leave this country in chaos for years. They cannot accept the will of the people, and maybe this is the way out. And folks, you know, there was an old saying at the start of all this, that nothing was agreed till everything was agreed. And there is a long history of 11th hour deals being done, smoke-filled rooms in Brussels and all the rest of it. And I'm not saying that. I mean, I hate Mrs. May's deal. I think it's a total shocker. But of course, even if this deal did go through, of course, it would then go in March to Strasbourg. It would then go for approval by the European Parliament. Mr. Verhofstadt has angrily replied, saying that we'll veto it in the European Parliament unless the backstop's there. But you know something? Mr. Verhofstadt, at the end of the day, isn't really quite as important as he thinks he is. It could be a political deal, political stitch-up, call it what you will, but it could be we've come a little bit closer to that today, and that Mr. Barnier has given us a pretty big clue. Back to the so-called People's Vote campaign and them dropping their amendment to push for a second referendum. Did they think they would lose in the House of Commons? Yes. Are they beginning to get worried they might lose in the country? I think they just might be. Steve is a first-time caller from Finchley. Good evening, Steve.
Hi, Nigel. How are you?
I am well. Now, I'm sensing from that accent that the backstop could be an issue you're going to talk about.
Well, it is certainly, and I mean, I've been involved in trading for a number of years, both when I lived in Ireland, also when I lived in England, and indeed over in various countries throughout the EU. And what astonishes me is that people cannot quite clearly see that the only reason the backstop is actually in the agreement, as it's called, is simply there to give the EU a big whipping stick for us, so that they can get whatever they don't have now, and keep us tied into the EU until they and get everything they want.
Yes, in terms of an issue, Steve, it's not much more than a hoax, the whole thing, and I've thought that for a long time. But let me ask you, Steve, if you can see it, and I can see it, why on earth, on the 8th of December 2017, did Mrs May sign up to it?
This is a question that it makes you doubt her real motivation, and makes the whole agreement look to me like it is I suppose let's call it a conspiracy, for want of another word, to actually keep us in the EU long term.
Is it really possible that a British Prime Minister set out, and you're the second caller tonight to hint this, is it really possible that a British Prime Minister set out to deceive the British people right from the start of her premiership?
I would say yes, and given what we're seeing from her other colleagues, for example, Mr. Hammond today, who's basically trying to manipulate the press to basically tell us that leaving with no deal is actually a betrayal of the referendum. His words, not mine, obviously. I can't see that really being very truthful either.
Steve, I hate conspiracy theory, and I hate this idea there's some big establishment plot and they've deceived us from the start, and that actually this government was never committed to it and didn't mean what it said at the general election. But when you look at the evidence, Steve, I'm with you. There's room to worry. And tell me, Steve, from your experience of living in Ireland, you know, whether we have a tariff-free deal or not, are you confident things would operate on that border smoothly?
Oh, of course. Not just in the Irish border, but probably into across the EU and into many, many other countries throughout the world.
I share your confidence. Thank you, Steve. Great call. Very interesting, actually. Quite a lot of you really, really, genuinely doubting the motives of the British Prime Minister. It's a pretty extraordinary state of affairs, but that is where we've got to. If the Northern Irish border is no longer a problem, why can't we just get a Canada Plus deal, says Marcus from Canary Wharf. Because, Marcus, we've never asked for it. It's unbelievable. Mrs May doesn't want a free trade deal. She wants a close and special partnership. She wants to opt back in to many of the parts that lots of us voted to leave. It's enough to make you tear your hair out. You're listening to the Nigel Farage Show here on LBC, and it's now 6:45 and time for the news headlines with Lisa Aziz. And Trevor from Sloane Square says, I want to ask Nigel if he'd accept the current deal with a time-limited backstop if he were in the Commons. Well, if this does get accepted, Trevor, I'm going to face this in Strasbourg, exactly that question, because it's the European Parliament. At the end of all of this, the European Parliament could veto the whole blooming thing. Would I vote for this, along the lines suggested yesterday by Daniel Kaczynski, if the backstop ended in 2025, 9 years after we voted to leave the European Union? No, Trevor. Now, Airbus, you've heard that name before. It often crops up when we're having debates about whether we should join the euro or whether we should vote Brexit or what we should do in the current circumstance. And before I say the rest of this, please do bear in mind that Airbus itself has been the receiver of very large EU subsidies over many, many years. But the head of Airbus tore into the government's handling of Brexit and said it was a disgrace, warning the company could pull out of the UK if its ability to compete on the global stage is harmed by a no-deal departure. Tom Enders, the chief executive, said a no-deal Brexit could force Airbus, which employs 14,000 people in the UK, with connected supply chains all over Europe, and they may have to make potentially very harmful decisions about their UK operations. Airbus senior vice president in the UK, Catherine Bennett, was then questioned about her motives for going public with the no-deal warning. This is interesting.
Operates an integrated way across Europe. It's so important that we put the facts on the table, and our CEO felt it was time, particularly this week, to get more information out there and exactly say how he felt.
Did the UK government put you up to this?
No, the government didn't. I mean, the government have been talking to us and other industry representatives all the time, of course, and we've given them lots of information about the potential impacts, but they did say, could you make sure that you make clear the potential impact of a no deal, and we're happy to do that.
Just
because no deal is potentially going to be catastrophic for us.
I mean, it's just outrageous, isn't it? Once again, the same old thing. Just as Cameron gave Obama that line, tell him that they'll be at the back of the queue, and Obama spouts it out. And here we've got, a senior vice president of Airbus admitting that the government asked them to go on and rubbish a no deal. So any of you that believe in Theresa May and that she wants a clean Brexit will realise next week why, when the House of Commons votes to stop a WTO Brexit, she will gleefully accept it. It is outrageous. Whose side are this government on? It's a hell of a question, isn't it? Now, back to the people's vote, who have backed away a bit today. Have they done it for strategic reasons, or are they actually in a bit of trouble with their campaign? Phil is a first-time caller from Finchley. Welcome, Phil.
Oh, good evening, Nigel. Hi. I'm one of those that I think you probably might call one of the maniacs. I did vote to leave with my wife in 2016. My 3 kids voted Remain. We voted Leave. But we've changed our minds. And it's interesting because I've been listening to you on the show talking about the 17.4 million, and I'm one of them, and all the rest of it. I'm proud I voted Leave, and I'm pleased I voted Leave. But I think I voted Leave in a kind of, I don't know, someone put it the other day, in a kind of democracy in darkness. I mean, I didn't know what I know now. And it's not just...
What about the European Army, Phil, you mean, and things like that?
The European Army, for me, you know and I know, I didn't know, but I now know, that if a European Army was to be created, it can only be done by unanimity. And I didn't know what unanimity was, but it can only be agreed upon if 28 member states agree. It's the same thing with immigration. Where I work, a good number of people voted to leave, but when we look at it in terms of where immigration is controlling our borders, I didn't know that we controlled our borders for non-EU citizens. I didn't know that. Call me stupid, call me a maniac.
And we did it when Theresa May was Home Secretary very badly. Phil, all right, look, whatever the reasons you changed your mind, and we get people coming on with both sides of this argument, obviously, Remainers that now feel the other way, etc. But Phil, do you support the campaign for a second referendum?
I support staying in and reforming it. I think now where I've got to, look, and I thank you for this, because you've taken me to the net, you've taken me to conversations that I would never, ever, ever have gone into. But I have done. I've asked questions, I've been to meetings, I went to one meeting, which was the Leavers all getting together, and I came out despondent because people started asking questions that I thought I knew the answer to, and I don't. And I'm not being rude or anything else.
But how are you going to reform it, Phil, when just this week we had an attempt at reform by Macron and Merkel, who want to centralise... Their use of the word reform is to centralise it even more deeply.
Elections, which I didn't know much about, there's been a swing... A large number of people voted to leave, and there's growing armies of people throughout Europe that worry about the free movement of people. And from what I can gather, there's a growing consensus that has to be changed within Europe. You change that. You change the process of free movement, and I can guarantee you one thing, Nigel, if there was a second vote, I would vote Remain, because that was the key issue for my wife and me, not my kids. I have to say
it hasn't changed. Phil, listen, it's a separate debate. It hasn't changed. But do you... So let me ask you one more time. Do you support a second referendum?
Because now I'm more enlightened. I can.
Do you support a second referendum?
I didn't know about.
Do you? Oh, okay, Phil. 3 strikes and you're out. One more try. Do you support a second referendum?
I do now.
Thank you. Why do you think that your guys withdrew the amendment today?
They're not my guys. They're nothing to do with me.
All right.
I have no relationship to these people. I voted Leave. I voted Leave for good reasons. I didn't believe in the European experiment. I've now got to the stage where I think that a number of things that I was told, and I have to say by you,
Phil,
Nigel,
we're discussing second... we're not having a big debate about Europe. We're having a debate about why these people withdrew the amendment and whether a second referendum is likely. Phil, interesting, lots to say, but I want to get a couple more calls in if I can. Malcolm is a first-time caller from Chichester in West Sussex. Good evening, Malcolm.
Hello.
So, they've withdrawn it. Are they beginning to get on the back foot slightly, or are they just biding their time?
I'm hoping they've withdrawn that idea of a second referendum. I really do. There's so many people that I hear on your show and other shows, especially that other guy that's... Brian, is it? The one after you?
Not after me, no. It's Dale after me. He's all right, generally, I promise you.
The Brian one, anyway. He's... I've listened to some people coming on there. I mean, he seems to pick the people that really do not understand what they're being told, and it's basic propaganda. I mean, you could say that the continental quilt's not going to work after Brexit, and a lot of people will believe it. You know, it's just ridiculous. I mean, the customs arrangements and what have you, it's still going to flow. Why are they believing it?
Malcolm, you know, I'm very struck that once again the president of the Port of Calais has said there will be no delays, even with a no-deal Brexit, and still they say it could be catastrophe and drugs won't get in and millions could die. But Malcolm, you know, do you think? I mean, are people becoming more scared by this, or are they more accepting now, perhaps, that we're going to leave?
There is a great percentage of people that are getting scared of this, and they are going to try and be on the side of safety. But it's just, you know, people like yourselves and Jacob, etc. They've got to get back onto that media, and they've got to put it out there to have faith and stand fast, because that's what British people have always done.
Well, let's hope they do it again. Malcolm, thank you. And I get asked here on Twitter, hey, Nigel, did Canada pay $39 billion for their free trade deal? No, they didn't. They didn't pay a penny piece. They don't have to accept judgments of the European Court of Justice. They don't have to accept the free movement of people. But the problem is, Mrs May never wanted a free trade deal. She wanted a close and special relationship, and that really is part of the problem. And David from Acton says, so we can sacrifice the backstop. It'll all prove to be a red herring to take attention off this terrible deal. And David, there are lots of MPs lining up ready to accept this terrible deal if the backstop goes. I think what you've seen from Barnier is significant. I don't believe the so-called people's vote have gone away. They'll be back at some point. But I would say this, listening to your calls tonight, I've never ever heard you as angry, as wound up and lacking so much in faith as our leaders in any point in my life. I'll be back with you on Sunday morning at 10 a.m. Tonight at 10 it's Tom Swarbrick, and up next it's Ian Dale.
I thought you could say the generally okay Ian Dale.
Well, that's quite nice of me, really.